My name is Alex Howard. For nearly 20 years, I've been a therapist here in London. I am deeply passionate about helping people make real, positive change in their lives. Having been through therapy myself at different stages of my own life, I know how transformative it can be. That's why I started In Therapy, a series that follows the stories of brave participants as they go on therapeutic journeys with me. Join us as we go behind the scenes as people grapple with issues like depression, anxiety, and chronic illness, and join my mission to break the stigma around mental health and asking for help. This is In Therapy with me, Alex Howard.
It's Wednesday night, it's 10 o'clock, and I'm at my part-time gig. I've had this job for about 10, 12 years where I sort of do some duty management for an arts organisation. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about just this constant hateful monologue in my head telling me that I'm not good enough, that I'm not worth shit, that I'm just worthless, that I don't deserve to be happy, you know? In a perverse way, there's something weirdly comforting about that, to know that you're your own worst enemy. To realise that, no one else could possibly hate you as much as you do, and I hope that's true. I really hope no one hates me as much as I do, because, I wouldn't want twos in the world, that would just be wrong.
So David, good to see you. How have you been doing since last time?
Yeah, okay. I'm a bit up and down, I suppose, but I've just been working constantly.
And last time we were talking about your inner critic, that sort of voice of judgment, criticism, and I asked you to sort of go away and spend some time sort of reflecting on it. And sort of, I was just wondering how that was.
I sort of started off trying to write down all the times that, that was happening. And I don't think I made it through one day. In fact, I know I didn't. I probably made it like 2 hours or something. Because it was just, I hadn't realised just how sort of constant it was.
Mm. And you didn't make it through because it was just so much volume of stuff, or because it felt too overwhelming to sort of put a spotlight on it?
It felt a little bit overwhelming. It was more just a little bit disturbing that I'd never really realised that it was as much, that it was as constant. And it was more just like, I don't actually have the time to write all this down. It was like literally, once I was sort of, I guess, aware of it or paying attention to it or whatever you want to, it just seemed like it was every decision.
Yeah.
Even down to, buying stuff in the supermarket. It was like very sort of vehement.
It was like a viciousness and a sort of cruelty to the quality of it.
Yeah, it was. When I just realised that it was almost constant.
Yeah. I'm sort of curious as to what you think is actually then the impact of that critical voice in your life.
Obviously, I think it's been a a negative impact. By writing it down and paying attention to it, it was almost like sort of empowering it. I've kind of moved house recently and I'm having difficulty
Yeah, I remember you
settling.
mentioned this. Yeah.
I'm even doing that thing now where I'm second guessing, oh well, maybe I should have stayed,
But in my mind, it's not so much the fact that you're having those thoughts of like, am I happy where I am? Should I stay where I was? Do I want to move? It's the fact that on top of that, there's then this layer of sort of criticism and judgment and I'm wondering there's a sort of the commentary on that, but then there's the judgment that comes in. What are the words of the voice of judgment? Like, what are the actual inner critic, I would call them inner critic attacks. Like, what are the ways that your inner critic actually attacks you? What would it actually say?
It goes, you fucking dick, if you'd waited 4 weeks, So it's things like that.
So that is a great example of your inner critic.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you're taking a sort of observation of life, like, maybe I should have waited to make the right decision, and then it becomes a value judgment on your worth as a human being.
Yeah.
How does it make you feel when you get attacked in that way?
Yeah, it's strange because it was about something fairly innocuous, and as I say, where I'm living, it's a nice flat, it's a nice area. A lot of the reason I'm having difficulty settling is my flatmate plays techno constantly.
Have you tried having a conversation with your flatmate and saying, the loud techno music, it's just like, what stops you from doing that? Because that sounds to me like a sort of reasonable request.
I mean, I've kind of had conversations with it. I don't think I've been stark enough. I've kind of said, can you turn it down? Or, can you maybe move it away from the wall where my head is? One thing that really actually gets on my tits is when she plays it late.
And late, what time?
Well, late enough where I'm thinking to myself, fucking hell, the neighbours can hear that. What if the neighbours have got like a kid, or what if they've got to get up at 8 o'clock in the morning? So if it's like sort of like midnight, 1 o'clock.
Yeah, that's
That's
late.
late.
That's late, man.
In fact, that's probably
I mean, it's past isn't it between 11 at night and 7 in the morning? It's like kind of legal kind of time.
I don't know, maybe. As I say, I keep odd hours, but yeah. So I mean, you've got kids, you'll know what time. If your neighbour was playing loud music, what time would piss you off?
7 o'clock because the kids go to bed.
But luckily, I mean, I don't think any of our neighbours have kids or anything like that. But I just know that if it was me and I was in the flat next door or the flat downstairs,
piss you off,
yeah.
Well, and you're in the same flat as pissing you off. But I'm wondering if one of the things that stops you from having a quite blunt conversation, saying, look, we're living together, we're sharing the space, and the loud music, really any time of the day is not really working for me, but particularly at sort of antisocial sort of times. I'm wondering if part of what stops you from having that conversation is your inner critic.
Maybe.
Like, what would your inner critic have to say about you having that conversation?
I think probably my inner critic's on my side on that one.
Might have you can say about
my inner critic's going to, sort of like going to get there and get a fucking help,
So what do you think does stop you from saying something?
Well, I mean, I've said things, but I've been.
But you've been very polite.
Yeah, I've been nice about it.
Like, it sounds like you haven't expressed how you really feel about it. Like, what I'm hearing is that you're fundamentally not feeling happy in the place that you're living.
I mean, part of it is the fact that I said I was fine with it before we moved in.
Right.
Okay. Like, and it's a big thing to her that she can listen to music, and I'm like, oh, I can understand that, and it's, but it's just the constancy of it.
And your flatmate can't use headphones. That's not something that she'd do.
She does use headphones, but she tends to use headphones when I come in and watch the news, or when I come in and watch Netflix. To me, it'd be a lot easier if she just used headphones more often.
Yeah. So it sounds to me like it's just a very blunt conversation I have. It's like, look, it's not really working, and I've actually been thinking about moving out, but I'd like to try and make it work. And I think for me to be happy and make it work, these are the sort of requests. These are the parameters, and it's not you must do this. It's that if you don't feel happy doing this, I think you need to find a new flatmate. Because I'm wondering if part of what may be happening is that because your inner critic can be so vicious and harsh, and you're on the receiving end of that, that sometimes we can be afraid of confrontation with others because our fear is that that inner critic's going to suddenly take over and sort of annihilate her. I don't know if that is a fear, if it's...
Yeah.
So say a bit about that.
I've never really seen it as an inner critic before, but I've always had a tendency to sort of escalate quite quickly. I'll go a certain amount of time where I'll let things go.
What I think is particularly interesting in what you're saying, and I think the parallel with your flatmate, is I wonder if what happens is a lot of the time in life, you under-express how you feel. So you sort of toe the easy line, sort of take the path of least resistance, don't want to have confrontation. And then the sort of irritation and the sort of anger and the frustration builds in you, and then something sort of snaps.
I don't know, I think I used to snap a lot quicker, and I think I probably still had the inner voice thing.
Right.
So I probably, I was probably giving myself a hard time then as well. It's just, I think what's happened is, I sort of moderated my behaviour.
Yeah, you've grown up a little bit as well.
So I'm less liable to...
maturity that's there.
I'm less liable to go into a pub and turn over a table now than when I was younger.
The healthier relationship we have with our inner critic, the more able we are to handle tricky situations in a more skillful way, because we're more able to say what we think earlier, because it can come from a more genuinely calm and sort of balanced and measured place. And if something just isn't working, we're more able to it's not working for me. But also then you don't have the sort of escalation and the sort of building up and then the sort of explosion of the inner critic that comes in that actually sort of makes things worse, not better quite often. Even if there's a sort of element of truth in what we're expressing, the way we express it makes things worse, in a sense. It sounds like this sort of ongoing judgment and criticizing and attack of your inner critic is having a sustained impact on probably on your mood, on your self-esteem, on your sort of sense of self-worth. Like, it's almost like having a mean, unpleasant person following you around the whole time and just saying unpleasant things at you the whole time. And it's like, it's not a surprise that after a while you just start to feel increasingly shit about yourself and about your life and about the world. Does that resonate? Yeah, it's like a evil Jiminy Cricket. Right. That's a good way of putting it.
And it's like I say, it's constant. It's like,
There's generally 3 different categories of how people tend to respond to it. So the first category is to sort of go into a sort of argument with it. So sort of fighting back against it. The second response is we sort of collapse in response to it. So it says, you're a dickhead, you're useless, and we just end up feeling deflated and defeated and sort of crap about ourselves. The third option is we tend to go into a sort of rationalizing debate with it. That it's sort of like we're sort of arguing our position, saying, well, I didn't really have any choice, I did the best I could at the time, and maybe I'll think... So we try to argue our way back in a sort of rational, logical way. So we either go to war with it and fight it, or we collapse, or we try to rationalize. There are other, obviously, options, but they're the kind of 3 main categories we tend to use. I'm wondering what you notice tends to be your sort of go-to response or responses, do you think, sort of day-to-day when the attacks are there?
I guess it depends on what it is, but I think more often than not, probably the latter 2.
Yeah. And I think it's worth saying that sometimes, but not always, with the inner critic, there's like a grain of truth in the attack. So not always the case, but sometimes what makes it so sort of tricky and toxic is it takes a little bit of truth and then inflates it and turns it into a sort of weapon against us, which, because of the grain of truth, we sort of get caught thinking, well, that's right. We take an example of, I don't know, it's a terrible example, but we go out and it's pouring rain this afternoon. We go out and we forget our coat. And the inner critic goes, you're such a fucking idiot for not wearing a coat. And we're like...
To be honest, you would be a fucking idiot if you'd done that. You're just pissing down the day.
I understand your point, but just to kind of complete my analogy, it's like there's a grain of truth, but the level of attack and judgment and criticism becomes disproportionate to the situation.
Yeah.
So it's like the inner critic finds our places of sort of vulnerability or sort of sensitivity, but then sort of turns it into a bat to sort of then beat us up and sort of attack us with. And it's important to be able to see it for what it is. That when we are attacking ourselves, criticizing ourselves, judging ourselves, there is almost never a useful outcome that comes from that. That's not to say there isn't a place for reflecting and going, you know, I could have done that better, or actually should have brought an umbrella today, or like, it's not that self-reflection isn't helpful, but the attack and the judgment isn't helpful, because actually what it does is it makes us feel less resourceful, it makes us feel worse about ourselves, which then makes us less able to deal with the situation if it requires dealing with anyway. If we can see it, that alone often can be a little bit empowering, because it's like, hang on a second, like, do I really need to speak to myself in that way? Like, and it can be quite challenging sometimes when you start to see it, like you experience, because you start to see it everywhere. But what we ultimately want to do is to learn to defend against the inner critic. That when it's attacking us, to have ways of responding that are not, because the problem is when you go into a sort of fight with it, you're actually, in a strange way, you're feeding it, because you're giving it more energy. It's sort of like a game of tennis. It just sort of, the ball goes back and forth. You're giving it more energy. When you collapse, you're just allowing it to sort of pile in on you. And when you rationalize, again, it's sort of like getting into an argument with someone, a very logical, rational argument, but you're just inflaming more the situation. So what we really need is a way of defending against it, which actually ends the attack that's happening. There are different ways of doing that. There are ways of doing it which are quite abrupt. You know, it's sort of like if you were walking down the street and someone, you know, that sort of Jiminy Cricket sort of character was sort of saying that to you. What you'd probably be thinking is actually just fuck off. So fuck off, like, leave me alone. And telling the inner critic to fuck off is sometimes one of the most helpful things that we can do. And it's not a fuck off going into a sort of attacking kind of response. It's like recognizing right now that voice is attacking me, telling it to fuck off, and then shifting your attention away from it. You've become so conditioned to criticizing and attacking yourself. It's like you've wired your brain unintentionally in a certain way. It's like going from point A to point B, like situation happens and then you attack yourself. And you do that enough times and that becomes a neural pathway in your brain. What we want to do is when you notice that you're criticizing and attacking yourself, to sort of stop that pathway and train a different habit, like train a different response in yourself. It's your sort of strength and your capacity that's being used to sort of beat you up. So taking that back and defending against it helps rebuild that sense of self-worth and self-value. I don't know if that makes a certain amount of sense. It's got a lot of just words I sort of threw at you.
No, it makes some sense, yeah.
So just to pause before we come into the next part of the session. In a minute, you're going to see David and I using some quite colourful language. There's a deliberate therapeutic reason of why we're doing this. There's a part of our mind which we've been exploring in the episode, our inner critic. And the part of us that tells us how we should speak, how we shouldn't speak, that we should behave nicely, whatever that means, is our inner critic. So one of the most helpful ways of taking our power back from our inner critic is acting in ways that it may disapprove of. So I know for some people, when I use colourful language, it can be a little offensive. That isn't my intention. This is very much done with a deliberate therapeutic intent. What I think would be helpful would be, and this might feel a bit strange, but to do a little bit of role playing with it. So you give me some of the inner critic attacks. I will be your inner critic, and you get the great pleasure that you're probably wishing you could do since the first moment you sat here to tell me to fuck off. But it's almost like by bringing it to life in that way, it makes it more real in a sense. If you were to sort of list some of like 3 or 4 of the most common attacks that you're sort of aware of, what do you think they might be?
A lot of the time they're about, personal relationships and friendships. They're about
life decisions, or
What might be some of the sort of go-to sort of phrases? And I'm going to make a couple of notes because I don't want to make up a taxi. What I'd like to do is to sort of use examples that are sort of real for you.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, there was the flat thing where it was like, you fucking dick, and that's quite a common one. Or, you message someone, or you talk to someone, and immediately the voice kind of goes, oh, you fucking shouldn't have said that, you dick,
I'm going to speak some of the sort of the attacks to you, and what I want you to do is defend in a sort of, and it's what we don't want to do is to become like super aggressive, because then it moves into the sort of tussle. But it also comes from a place of sort of groundedness and just sort of like speaking the truth. And there's different ways you can do it. So it could just be, I'm not going to say it direct to your face because I don't want to sort of, but it's something like fuck off, or it could be how dare you speak to me that way, or get out of my face. Like there's different sort of different versions, let's say, of how you could do it. What we're not doing is going into the content. Mm-hmm. So it's not, don't call me this. It's not having a conversation. It's like taking that tennis analogy. It's sort of whacking the ball and walking off the court. So you're not staying to sort of engage with it. And then let's just notice, as we'll just play with it a little bit, and just notice how it feels in the process of doing it. The first one we'll do is the flat situation. So I'll sort of say roughly what I think your inner critic was saying, and just treat me as your inner critic and see what it feels like to defend against it. You really should have waited another 4 weeks, you dickhead.
Yeah, probably should have.
Did that feel like, because that sort of felt like you were agreeing with it?
Yeah, a little bit.
So what would defending against that sound like?
I don't know really, because it's like, it's a situation where there is a part of me thinking, yeah, I should have waited.
But let's separate. Remember what I said earlier about the grain of truth. So let's separate that in hindsight, because hindsight's a wonderful thing, right? In hindsight, you wish you'd waited, and that's true. But let's separate that from the fact that you didn't know that at the time, because equally at the time you could have been accused of missing a great opportunity by messing around. Yeah. So let's separate that from the fact that you're being attacked. You're being judged in your value as a human being by the fact that you made in hindsight a decision that you might not have made. Yeah? Mm-hmm. So from that place, how would you defend against it?
I'd probably try and ignore it. But I mean, I guess, sort of like, I guess the automatic response to all of them would be fuck off.
Yeah, so let's start there. Because what we want to do is to break a cycle of something that's just been in a habit of sort of going round and round, right? So sometimes it needs a bit of don't punch me in the face, but sometimes it needs a little bit of a sort of push to sort of break out the habit of it. So let's do it again. So, you really should have waited 4 weeks, you dickhead.
Oh, fuck off.
Okay, how did that feel?
Felt like my teenage years.
Do you feel, it felt to me that it was a bit more like, a bit more of a sort of pushback against it.
Yeah.
Does it feel that way to you?
Yeah, but I guess what I'm finding a wee bit difficult about it is it's in my head.
Yeah.
It's if it's somebody sitting in front of me, or if it's somebody on the bus, or if it's somebody walking down the street, you can sort of say fuck off, and get away from them.
But you can also say fuck off inside of your head.
But I think the thing is, it's like, if it happens in the real world, you can walk away from them, or you can smack them, or whatever.
Yeah, sure.
Whereas when it's in your own head, you can't really get away from it.
It can feel like you're completely consumed by it because it's always been there, right?
Yeah.
And it's almost hard to imagine life without it sort of being there in that way. But it is possible to defend and get some space from it. And given that it's so prevalent in a sense at the moment, where we're probably going to start is picking a few examples that you practice with. So it might be that it goes from being there, 9 out of 10 times in the day to being there 8 out of 10 times in the day. So we're not looking for a response that just sort of spontaneously disappears. but it's beginning to reclaim some of the space inside of your own mind, which at the moment, because there's not been any sort of strategies or tools to work with it, it's just sort of gradually become increasingly consumed. And we want to start to reclaim some of your internal space.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make a bit more sense?
Yeah.
What I want you to work with is, as you notice more the inner critic, and that spotlight's already there, so that awareness is building. What I want you to work on is, as you notice it, inside of your mind, practice telling it to fuck off. As you do that, noticing that there's just a little bit of a gradual sort of reclaiming of your space, of your permission to be yourself and to make mistakes in the world and be human. And that doesn't give your inner critic the right to tear into you and judge you and beat you up for that.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What questions you got?
None at the moment. It sounds like an easy, rational thing to do.
It's not easy. It's simple, but it's not easy.
That's what I mean.
Yeah. But learning to be softer and kinder to yourself can have an enormous impact on many areas of your life. So it's something that is worth putting the time and the energy into. But it's a process. It's not like you do it once and it all changes. It's a process. You're literally rewiring a part of your mind which has been spent years being conditioned in a certain way, and it takes time to shift and to change that. But the first step is awareness. The second step is then defending against what's happening.
Okay.
Good. Great, David. Well, thank you very much.
Cool. Thanks.
Good.
Uncomfortable is the wrong word, or, embarrassed, that's the wrong word too, but it was like, where Alex was role-playing as my critical inner voice, and I was fighting back. It was almost like for a moment I was kind of standing outside myself, watching the role-play thing. Maybe it was my inner voice, my Jiminy Cricket standing outside myself, but it felt unreal, unnatural. But I think because I haven't been doing it, and I've all been doing is working, I haven't really had the chance to sort of put into practice this idea yet of, fighting back. But what was interesting was tonight, I did like an online meet-up with, some good friends, and I told them that I was doing this therapy thing and that it was being filmed, and they were all very supportive. But there was one girl who contacted me, privately afterwards, away from everyone else, to sort of say she sort of expressed some concern, some worry. She was like, I think it's quite dangerous for you to be that open and vulnerable, in that kind of way, it's and she also asked, did I have any sort of control over the edit? Did I have editorial control? And I wouldn't want editorial control, because, the reason I'm doing that is doing this whole thing is because I'm interested to see what it reveals about me. I'm as interested as you lot to find out what's going on in my head and what makes me tick, and to see what this journey brings me.
I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of In Therapy. David's homework from this session was to really practice defending against his inner critic. This is a whole set of tools, and it's one of the key things we teach as part of the Reset program, which, by the way, is opening for registration again in a few weeks' time. You can find out more at alexhoward.com. But there's going to be some tips and strategies to help you start the process of defending against your inner critic on my Instagram. So head over there now and you'll get some of the guidance that David had as part of his homework. Next week on In Therapy, we're going to be catching up with Katie. In Katie's first episode, we started to explore this idea that at the core of many of her struggles is her relationship with herself. And in the next episode, we start to explore how that relationship needs to and how that relationship ultimately can change. I talk a bit about this idea of get into jail free cards, certain ways that we almost guarantee we get stuck in our thinking, and how to recognize those and start to change those. Here's a taste of what's coming up next week with Katie. Well, Katie, welcome back. How have you been doing?
Not brilliant. I suppose it's a bit like a metamorphosis. I'm sort of discarding that character that I created. There's a reluctance to fully get rid of it because I don't really know what's underneath, and it's really frightening.
So it's almost like we have to make the space for something else to happen, but that making the space can be a really quite difficult process.